At my grandfather's funeral, my boyfriend whispered, "Can we leave? This is so boring, and I have brunch plans." I said, "You should go." He left. I stayed, gave the eulogy, and never called him again. My name is Naomi Carter. I was 29 years old when I buried the only father figure I had ever known. Most people think grief arrives like a storm. For me, it felt more like the floor disappearing. My grandfather had raised me since I was 6. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to negotiate the price of a used car, how to tell when someone was lying by watching their eyes instead of listening to their words. He was the steady thing in every chapter of my life. When he died, it felt impossible that the world was still moving. Traffic still existed. Coffee shops still opened. People still argued about meaningless things online. Meanwhile, the man who had taught me what loyalty looked like was gone. At the time, I had been dating Adrian Cole for 8 months. Looking back now, the warning signs seem obvious. Adrian cared a lot about appearances. Sometimes it was charming. Sometimes it was exhausting. He remembered birthdays without reminders. He used to bring coffee to my office when he knew I had a difficult week ahead. He could be thoughtful when he wanted to be. Maybe that's why I ignored the warning signs for so long. It's easier to walk away from someone who is cruel all the time. It's much harder to leave someone who occasionally becomes the person you hoped they really were. When you're busy imagining a future with someone, it's surprisingly easy to explain away things that should worry you. They explain them away. I certainly did. The funeral chapel was crowded. Rows of dark suits. The scent of lilies. Quiet crying. My grandfather had touched more lives than I ever realized. I sat in the front pew, staring at the polished wood of the casket. In 10 minutes, I would have to stand up and speak. I kept repeating the opening lines of my eulogy inside my head. Beside me, Adrian shifted again. And again. And again. The pew creaked every time he moved. A long sigh. A glance at his watch. Another sigh. I ignored it. I told myself everyone handles grief differently. Then the pastor began the prayer. The room became silent. And suddenly I felt Adrian tap my leg. I turned slightly. His phone screen was glowing brightly in the dim chapel. He leaned close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne. Then he whispered, "Can we leave? This is so boring. I have brunch plans with Maya at 1. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. I stared at him, at the carefully styled hair, the flawless smile he used in photos, the bored expression, the impatient tapping of his thumb. It wasn't cruelty. Cruelty would have required awareness. This was worse. It was indifference. My grandfather's funeral wasn't a tragedy to him. It was an interruption. Something inside me went completely still. No anger. No tears. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when a door closes and locks forever. I looked directly at him. "You should go." His eyebrows lifted. "What?" "You should go." He blinked. "You're coming too, right?" "No." I turned back toward the front. "I'm staying." The offended look on his face was almost unbelievable, like I had somehow ruined his day. He grabbed his jacket, muttered something under his breath, then squeezed past me. I heard his shoes echo against the chapel floor as he walked toward the exit. He never looked back. A few minutes later, I stood at the podium. I looked out at the people who loved my grandfather. Then I began speaking. I talked about honor, about responsibility, about keeping your word. Halfway through, I caught myself thinking about Adrian. I wasn't thinking about missing him. I was thinking about how little he understood the values my grandfather lived by. After the service ended, I went home alone. I poured a glass of the cheap scotch my grandfather used to drink, sat on my couch, and stared into the dark. The strangest part came afterward. Adrian never called, never texted. Not that day. Not the next day. Not the day after that. 3 full days passed. Later, I learned he was waiting for me to apologize. In his version of events, I had embarrassed him. I had been rude. I had overreacted. Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed. A single text. "Adrian, are we good?" No apology. No condolences. No "how are you holding up?" Just a routine maintenance check. As if my grief had become inconvenient. I stared at the screen for several seconds, then typed one character. I sent it. Blocked his number. Blocked Instagram. Blocked Facebook. Blocked everything. For the first time all week, I felt lighter. That feeling lasted exactly 2 hours. Then the voicemails started. The first voicemail arrived just after sunset. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, eating takeout noodles from a white cardboard container, when my phone vibrated against the wood. Unknown number. I ignored it. A minute later, it rang again. Then again. Then again. By the 4th call, curiosity finally won. I opened the voicemail transcription. The first message read, "Are you serious right now? You're blocking me because I wanted food? Naomi, you're being dramatic. Call me back. We have festival tickets next weekend, and we need to figure things out." I listened without expression. It wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't say. Not once did he mention my grandfather. Not once did he ask how I was surviving the worst week of my life. His biggest concern was a music festival. The second voicemail arrived 20 minutes later. His voice sounded sharper, more irritated. Okay, now you're actually scaring me. This silent treatment stuff is abusive, Naomi. My mom says you're probably grieving, but you're taking it out on me. Pick up. The third one came before midnight. This time he wasn't worried. He was angry. I sat in that church for an hour for you. An hour. I supported you, and somehow I'm the bad guy? Stop acting like a victim and call me. I deleted every message. Deleting them felt easier than arguing with them. Because I finally understood something my grandfather used to say. People tell you who they are long before they show you. The problem is that love often makes us bilingual. We hear the warning and translate it into something kinder. For 8 months, I had been translating Adrian. Now I was hearing him in his original language. And suddenly everything made sense. The weekend passed quietly. I spent most of it sorting through my grandfather's belongings. Old photographs, military medals, handwritten notes folded into drawers, a faded grocery list written in the same neat handwriting I had known since childhood. Grief is strange. Sometimes it arrives as sobbing. Sometimes it arrives as finding an old receipt and realizing the person who touched it no longer exists. There were moments I would pick up something completely ordinary and feel my chest tighten. The object itself didn't matter. What hurt was realizing whose hands would never touch it again. Yet despite all that pain, something unexpected happened. I began feeling lighter. The constant pressure Adrian brought into every room wasn't there anymore. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't managing his moods. I wasn't worrying whether he felt entertained. For the first time in months, silence felt peaceful instead of uncomfortable. That should have been my clue. Healthy love makes life feel larger, not heavier. Monday evening, around 6 o'clock, somebody started pounding on my apartment door. Not knocking. Pounding. The sound rattled the wall. I froze, then walked quietly toward the entryway. When I looked through the peephole, I immediately wished I hadn't. Adrian. And standing behind him was Maya, the same friend he had been rushing to meet for brunch. Both looked furious. I stepped back. My grandfather had bought me a video doorbell 2 years earlier. One of those gifts you don't think much about until you need it. He always used to say, "Trust people if you want, just don't leave yourself blind." I opened the camera app. Adrian raised his fist and slammed it against the door again. "Naomi." I pressed the intercom button. "Go away." The reaction was immediate. His head snapped toward the camera. "I know you're in there." "Then you know I meant what I said." "Open the door." "No." His face reddened. Maya folded her arms. The self-righteous expression on her face made it clear she believed she was witnessing some terrible injustice. "Naomi," Adrian shouted, "you can't just steal my property." Property. The word almost made me laugh. He had never lived there, never paid rent there, never received mail there. He spent maybe 2 nights a week at my apartment. "What property?" "My hoodie, my skincare bag, my charger." I stared at the screen. That was it. 3 items. 3 completely replaceable items. Yet somehow they had become the justification for a full-scale siege. Fortunately, I had anticipated this. The day I blocked him, I packed everything he had left behind into a grocery bag and placed it inside the closet near my front door. Not because I expected drama, because I wanted closure. Real closure isn't a conversation. It's accepting that the conversation is over. I grabbed the bag, walked back to the door, unlocked it, but kept the security chain attached. The door opened a few inches. Immediately, Adrian pushed forward, not enough to get inside, just enough to prove exactly why I had no intention of letting him in. "We need to talk." "No," I said calmly. "We don't." I shoved the grocery bag through the opening. It bounced against his chest. His expression shifted from outrage to disbelief. "There's your stuff." "Naomi." "We're done. You can't do this." Maya stepped forward. "You're having some kind of breakdown." I almost smiled. The moment someone loses access to you, they suddenly become very interested in explaining why your boundaries are unfair. "No," I said. "I'm finally thinking clearly." Adrian stared at me. Then his face hardened. It was a funeral. The words came out sharp. Defensive. Desperate. As if leaving early is some unforgivable crime. For a second, I simply looked at him. Not angry. Not hurt. Just tired. Because he still didn't understand. Even now. Even standing there. Even after everything. He thought this was about leaving. Not about why he left. Not about what he said. Not about the fact that the person I loved most in the world was lying inside a casket while he worried about brunch reservations. Some people spend their whole lives missing the point. "Goodbye, Adrian." Then I closed the door, locked it, and walked away. 30 seconds later, I heard him screaming through the hallway. 5 minutes later, I heard Maya screaming too. 20 minutes after that, there was another knock at my door. A real one this time. When I checked the peephole, 2 police officers were standing outside, and behind them stood Adrian and Maya, both wearing the smug expressions of people who thought they were finally about to win. I opened the door. The older officer stood in front. The younger one looked exhausted in the specific way police officers often do when they've already dealt with 3 ridiculous situations before dinner and know a 4th is waiting. Behind them stood Adrian and Maya. Both looked confident, almost excited. The kind of confidence people have when they're convinced reality is about to agree with them. "Good evening, ma'am," the older officer said politely. "We received a report regarding stolen property." I stepped aside slightly and opened the door wider. "Come in if you'd like." The officer shook his head. "That won't be necessary right now." Then he looked toward Adrian. "What property are we talking about exactly?" Adrian immediately launched into his performance. "My belongings." The officer waited. "My hoodie, my charger, my skincare bag." The officer blinked. "And my festival ticket." There was a brief silence. The older officer glanced toward me, then back toward Adrian, then back toward me again. I could almost see him mentally recalculating how much paperwork this call was about to generate. "I returned everything except the ticket," I explained. "Why?" "Because I bought both tickets." Adrian immediately pointed at me. "That's not true. One of them was mine." The officer looked at him. "Did you pay for it?" Adrian hesitated, only for a second. But it was enough. "No." The officer nodded slowly. That single answer changed the entire conversation. Sometimes people think arguments are won by emotion. They aren't. Most arguments are won or lost by one inconvenient fact. "No," the officer repeated, "you didn't pay for it." "I was going to." The officer remained expressionless. "But you didn't." Adrian's confidence visibly faltered. "I would have sent the money." "When?" Another pause. No answer. The older officer turned toward me. "Do you have proof of purchase?" I already had my phone ready. I pulled up the text messages. Months earlier, when the festival tickets first went on sale, the conversation was simple. "Adrian, please buy them before they sell out. I'll send you my half Friday. Promise." My reply: "Done. 860 total." The officer read the messages, then handed the phone back. His expression didn't change, but I could tell the matter was effectively over. Adrian kept adding details every time he told the story. The actual facts never changed. The officer looked directly at Adrian. "This appears to be a civil dispute." "What?" Adrian snapped. "A civil dispute. But she's keeping my ticket." "You haven't paid for the ticket." "But it was understood." "Sir." The officer's voice remained calm. The calmness somehow made the words land harder. "If you want compensation, you can pursue it through small claims court." Adrian stared. The officer continued, "But we cannot force someone to surrender property they purchased." I watched disbelief spread across Adrian's face. It reminded me of a child discovering gravity for the first time. Not because gravity is unfair, because gravity refuses to negotiate. For months I had watched people accommodate him. Friends, coworkers, even me. Whenever something didn't go his way, somebody eventually adjusted reality for him. This was one of the first times reality refused, and he genuinely didn't know how to react. Then Maya stepped forward, her patience finally gone. "She's doing this because she's bitter." The younger officer sighed. Actually sighed. Not dramatically. Just enough for everyone to hear. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The older officer turned toward me. "Do you want them removed from the property?" "Yes," I answered immediately. Revenge wasn't even part of the equation anymore. I was simply tired. Tired of explaining basic decency to someone determined not to understand it. The officer nodded, then looked toward Adrian. "You heard her." Adrian stared at me. The anger in his eyes wasn't the kind that comes from heartbreak. It was the anger of someone losing control. Those two things look similar from far away. They're not. Heartbreak mourns what was lost. Control mourns what it can no longer command. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. The words hung in the air. Years ago, they might have scared me. That night, they felt strangely empty. Because regret only works as a threat when someone still wants what you're offering. I didn't. Not anymore. The officers escorted them away. Their voices echoed down the hallway. Adrian was still arguing, still insisting, still trying to convince the universe that his feelings should override facts. Then the elevator doors closed, and silence returned. I closed my apartment door, locked it, and leaned against it for a long moment. The entire encounter had lasted maybe 30 minutes. Yet I felt exhausted. Not because of the confrontation, because I finally understood something painful. The relationship I thought I had never really existed. I had spent 8 months loving a version of Adrian that lived mostly inside my own hopes. The real Adrian was the man who interrupted a funeral for brunch plans, The real Adrian was the man who called the police over a ticket he never paid for. The real Adrian was the man standing in a hallway trying to convince strangers that grief should operate on his schedule. Sometimes healing begins the moment an illusion dies. That night I made tea, sat on my balcony, and watched the city lights flicker below. For the first time since my grandfather's funeral, I felt something that wasn't grief. It wasn't happiness. Not yet. It was relief. The relief that comes when you stop carrying a weight you didn't realize was crushing you. I thought that was the end. I truly did. I thought Adrian would finally understand. That eventually he would tell the story to someone else and hear how unreasonable it sounded. Looking back, I don't think Adrian was trying to tell a lie. I think he genuinely preferred the version of the story where he hadn't done anything wrong. Most people rewrite the story instead. And a few days later, Adrian began rewriting ours. The first sign arrived in my inbox. The email wasn't from him. It was from his mother. The subject line read, "Disappointed in you." And somehow, before I even opened it, I already knew things were about to get much worse. I let the email sit unopened for almost 2 days. The truth was, I already knew exactly what it was going to say. When you've dealt with enough people who refuse accountability, you start recognizing the script before they even begin reading from it. The names change. The details change. The ending never does. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. One Tuesday evening, after work, I poured myself a cup of coffee and opened it. The first sentence made me laugh out loud. Not because it was funny, because it was so predictable. According to Adrian's mother, he hadn't been bored at the funeral. He had been suffering from anxiety. The atmosphere had overwhelmed him. His comment about brunch had supposedly been a coping mechanism, a grounding technique, a way to manage his emotions. I stared at the screen. Then I looked around my apartment. The apartment where I had spent weeks sorting through my grandfather's belongings. The apartment where I had cried alone when nobody was watching. The apartment where I was still trying to understand how someone who raised me could simply stop existing. And somehow I was supposed to believe Adrian had been the victim that day. The email continued for nearly 1,000 words. Every paragraph performed the same magic trick. It took Adrian's choices and turned them into my responsibility. It took his behavior and transformed it into my misunderstanding. It took my boundaries and labeled them cruelty. By the end, his mother demanded 3 things. I should apologize. I should unblock Adrian. And I should reimburse him financially because he had been so emotionally devastated by the breakup that he had missed work. I actually reread that part twice, not because I misunderstood it, because I wanted to make sure another human being had genuinely typed those words. Then I closed the email, created a folder called Trash Fire, and moved it there. There are moments in life when responding feels satisfying. This wasn't one of them. Arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you is like trying to mop up the ocean. No matter how much effort you expend, the water keeps coming. So I moved on. At least I tried to. A few days later, my phone started buzzing. Messages from friends. Screenshots. Questions. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. Then I opened the first screenshot. And there it was. Adrian's social media post. A carefully edited selfie. Perfect lighting. Perfect angle. Tears visible but somehow photogenic. The caption read, "Sometimes the people you support through their darkest moments become the ones who hurt you the most. Healing isn't linear, but surviving is possible." Below it were hashtags. Hashtag healing journey. Hashtag toxic relationship. Hashtag survivor. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then another screenshot arrived. Then another. Then another. Over the next week, Adrian slowly built a version of events that barely resembled reality. According to his posts, I had become cold and unstable after the funeral. I had isolated him, emotionally punished him, thrown him away without explanation. He never directly described what happened. That was the clever part. Specific facts can be disproven. Vague accusations are much harder to fight. For a while it worked. A few people believed him. A few acquaintances sent passive-aggressive messages. One person I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year somehow felt qualified to explain healthy relationships to me. I ignored all of it, mostly because I was tired. By then, even simple tasks felt heavier than they should have. Some evenings, I would sit in the same chair for half an hour before realizing my coffee had gone cold in my hands. I didn't have the strength for internet warfare. Then Adrian made a mistake. The kind people make when they start believing their own lies. The kind that turns a manageable problem into a disaster. He began telling people I had stolen funeral money. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Then more screenshots appeared. Different conversations. Different people. Same accusation. Apparently, I had accepted financial help from Adrian and never repaid him. Apparently, he had supported me through the funeral. Apparently, he had contributed thousands of dollars. I sat at my kitchen table reading those claims. Something inside me shifted. Not anger, not even outrage, just certainty. Because grief is personal, but accusations of theft follow you, especially in my profession, especially when your reputation matters. My grandfather used to say that character takes years to build and 5 minutes to damage. For the first time since the breakup, I decided to respond. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just with facts. I opened my laptop, gathered documentation, the prepaid funeral plan my grandfather purchased decades earlier, the payment records, the funeral home's confirmation paperwork, every piece of evidence. Then I made a single post. 1. No insults, no name calling, no accusations. Just truth. I uploaded a photograph of the funeral program, alongside a redacted document showing the funeral expenses had already been paid years before. Then I wrote, "Grieving is difficult enough without misinformation. My grandfather arranged and paid for his funeral long ago. No one loaned me money. No one financed these services. If you left before the eulogy to attend brunch, please stop describing yourself as my primary support system." That was it. No dramatic ending. No emotional speech. No public execution. Just facts. The response was immediate. People who had been quietly supporting Adrian stopped talking. Several mutual friends reached out privately. Others simply disappeared. The momentum of his story collapsed almost overnight. Because the problem with lies is that they require maintenance. Adrian's story started collapsing the moment real documents entered the conversation. Screenshots and emotions can travel fast. Paperwork usually travels farther. But Adrian wasn't finished. People like him rarely stop when they hit a wall. They simply start looking for another door. 3 days later, I came home from work and found a handwritten invoice taped to my apartment door. At first, I thought it was a joke. Then I started reading and realized Adrian had somehow managed to become even more ridiculous. I stood in the hallway holding the invoice for a long moment before I finally laughed. Not a happy laugh. Not even an angry one. The kind of laugh that escapes when reality becomes so absurd your brain briefly stops knowing how else to respond. The paper had been torn from a notebook. The handwriting was unmistakably Adrian's. Across the top, in large letters, he had written, "Outstanding balance." Underneath was an itemized list. Emotional support during family crisis, $500. Hospital visits, $600. Wardrobe consultation for funeral attire, $200. Festival ticket reimbursement, and $800. The total came to over $2,000. I read it twice, then a third time. Each line somehow managed to be more unbelievable than the one before it. He was charging me for visiting my dying grandfather, charging me for sitting beside a hospital bed, charging me for existing during one of the worst periods of my life. What struck me most wasn't the amount. It was the mindset behind it. Healthy relationships don't keep score. Looking at that invoice, I realized Adrian had been keeping score the entire time. And looking back, that realization explained far more about our relationship than the paper itself. I took a photo, removed the invoice from my door, then walked directly to the leasing office. The manager, an older man named Mr. Dawson, listened patiently while I explained everything. The police visit, the social media campaign, the false accusations, the invoice. When I finished, he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the photograph. Then he shook his head. "Hospital visits?" "Apparently." He snorted. "That's a new one." I couldn't help smiling. For the first time in weeks, somebody else's reaction reminded me I wasn't losing my mind. Because that's what prolonged conflict does, especially when you're grieving, especially when someone keeps insisting you're the unreasonable one. Eventually, you start checking your own reflection. You start wondering if maybe you missed something. Maybe you were too harsh. Maybe you overreacted. Maybe they're right. That's why manipulation works. Not because it's convincing, because it's exhausting. Mr. Dawson handed the photo back. "If he comes back, call security immediately." "I will." "If his car enters the property, we'll deal with it." I thanked him and left. For a few days, things were quiet again. And during those quiet days, I found myself thinking about my grandfather more than Adrian, which felt like progress. Grief doesn't disappear. It simply changes shape. At first, it's a hurricane. Then it becomes weather. Still present. Still capable of surprising you, but no longer destroying everything it touches. Some mornings, I would wake up and instinctively think about calling him. Then reality would return. A small ache. A familiar ache. One that sat quietly beside me instead of crushing my chest. Those moments hurt, but they felt honest. The drama with Adrian didn't. That situation felt artificial, like noise, like static interrupting something sacred. Maybe that's why I finally stopped feeling guilty. Not because I hated him. I didn't. Hate requires emotional investment. And by then, I simply didn't have any left. Then one afternoon, my lawyer friend called. His name was Ryan. We had known each other since college. After listening to the latest update, he remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he said, "You know this isn't normal, right? I figured that out." "No, Naomi, I mean legally." I leaned back in my chair. "What are you suggesting?" "A cease and desist." I thought about it. Part of me hated the idea. Not because he was wrong. Because involving lawyers felt like admitting the situation had become real. Up until then, a part of me still believed Adrian would eventually wake up one morning and realize how ridiculous all of this was. But people don't always arrive at self-awareness. Some spend their entire lives running from it. "What would it do?" Ryan explained. "It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't an attack. It was a warning, a formal line in the sand, a document stating that the harassment, the false statements, and the repeated contact needed to stop. Otherwise, stronger action would follow." By the end of the conversation, I agreed. $300 later, the letter was drafted. Professional, direct, emotionless, which somehow made it more powerful. The letter outlined the documented harassment, the false allegations involving funeral expenses, the attempts to damage my reputation, the unwanted contact. Then it stated clearly that any future escalation could result in legal action. Nothing dramatic, nothing threatening, just consequences. Real consequences. Ryan mailed it certified to Adrian's mother's address, because according to mutual friends, Adrian had temporarily moved back in with her. When the delivery confirmation arrived a few days later, I barely thought about it. I assumed he would ignore it. Maybe complain about it online. Maybe make another social media post. What I didn't expect was the voicemail. 3 hours after delivery confirmation appeared in my inbox, my phone rang from an unknown number. I didn't answer. The voicemail notification appeared a minute later. I pressed play. At first, I almost didn't recognize his voice. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. For the first time since all of this started, Adrian sounded scared. Actually scared. "Naomi, what are you doing?" There was a pause. Then a shaky breath. "You got lawyers involved over a breakup?" Another pause. "You are ruining my life." I listened quietly. The irony wasn't lost on me. For weeks, he had accused me of being cruel. Yet every choice that brought him here had been his own. Every escalation, every lie, every confrontation. Listening to that voicemail, I realized Adrian still saw himself as the victim of someone else's decisions. He never seemed to notice how many of those decisions had started with him. The truth is usually less dramatic. Most consequences are simply your actions returning home. The voicemail continued. "My mom is freaking out." Another breath. "I just wanted what I was owed." I closed my eyes. There it was. The sentence that explained everything. Not grief. Not heartbreak. Not love. Entitlement. The belief that the world owed him something. The belief that other people existed to provide comfort, attention, understanding, forgiveness, and endless second chances. The letter hadn't frightened him because it was aggressive. It frightened him because for the first time, someone had refused to participate. I deleted the voicemail. Then I set my phone down. Outside, the sun was beginning to disappear behind the buildings. The sky glowed orange. The city moved on. Cars passed below. People laughed somewhere down the street. Life continued doing what life always does, moving forward whether we're ready or not. And for the first time in a very long time, I had the feeling that this story was finally approaching its end. I was wrong, because Adrian still had one final mistake left to make. The final mistake came from someone I hadn't been thinking about at all. Maya. For weeks, she had functioned like Adrian's personal echo chamber. Every bad decision he made seemed to arrive with her approval attached. Every unreasonable demand somehow became reasonable the moment she repeated it loudly enough. Looking back, I think some friendships aren't built on honesty. They're built on mutual validation. You tell me I'm right. I'll tell you you're right. And together we'll protect each other from the uncomfortable possibility that we're both wrong. A week after the cease and desist letter was delivered, I got an email from Human Resources. For a moment, my stomach tightened. Not because I thought I had done anything wrong, because nobody likes receiving unexpected messages from HR. My manager called me into his office that afternoon. He closed the door, motioned for me to sit. Then he slid a printed email across the desk. I recognized the accusations immediately. Unstable behavior, emotional abuse, financial misconduct, violent tendencies, anonymous sender. But it didn't take a detective to figure out where it came from. The language was practically identical to everything Adrian had been posting online. I finished reading and looked up. My manager was already shaking his head. "You know who sent this?" "I have a pretty good guess." "Thought so." Then he leaned back in his chair. "I'm only bringing it up because company policy requires documentation." I nodded. He continued. "Frankly, this reads like breakup drama. The tension I hadn't realized I was carrying slowly left my shoulders. I explained everything: the funeral, the police report, the harassment, the lawyer's letter, the social media accusations. By the time I finished, he looked exhausted on my behalf. People are unbelievable. Sometimes. He gave a small laugh, then pushed the email aside. You're fine, Naomi. Just keep doing your job. When I left his office, I found myself smiling for the first time in weeks. Not because I had won. That word never felt right. I never liked the idea of winning a breakup. There was nothing to win here. My grandfather was still gone. The relationship was still over, as if the goal is to walk away with the higher score. But that's not how life works. Nobody wins when trust dies. Nobody wins when grief becomes collateral damage. Nobody wins when someone you cared about reveals a version of themselves you wish you had never met. What you hope for isn't victory, it's peace. And finally, peace was beginning to arrive. Months passed. The phone stayed silent. No more voicemails. No more emails. No more invoices taped to my door. No more social media campaigns. The legal letter had done what common sense never could. It created a boundary that couldn't be argued with. One evening, a mutual friend reached out. One of the few people who had remained neutral throughout everything. We met for coffee. Halfway through the conversation, he hesitated, then asked carefully, "Do you want to know how Adrian's doing?" I thought about it. To my surprise, the answer was yes. Enough time had passed that curiosity felt harmless. Apparently, Adrian was dating someone new, a woman he'd met shortly after everything ended. According to social media, they were very happy, at least publicly. The friend showed me a photo. Adrian stood beside a smiling woman at a rooftop restaurant. The caption read, "Finally found someone who knows how to appreciate me. No drama, no negativity, just love." I looked at the picture, then handed the phone back. My friend waited for a reaction. I didn't have one. Not really. Because the strangest thing about healing is the moment you realize a story no longer belongs to you. Once upon a time, seeing that photo would have ruined my day. Then maybe my week. Now it felt like looking at strangers. Whatever happened next in Adrian's life wasn't my responsibility. Maybe he'd change. Maybe he wouldn't. That lesson belonged to somebody else now. When I got home that evening, the apartment was quiet. The kind of quiet that used to feel lonely. Now it felt comforting. I made myself a cup of coffee, stepped onto the balcony, and watched the city lights slowly appear beneath the darkening sky. The urn containing my grandfather's ashes still sat on the mantel inside. I hadn't decided where to scatter them yet. Part of me wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be completely ready. Grief doesn't work on deadlines. It doesn't care about calendars. It simply becomes part of who you are. A scar instead of a wound. I thought about my grandfather, about everything he had taught me. Most of the lessons people remember aren't the big speeches. They're the small moments, the casual comments, the habits, the examples. I remembered him once telling me that character is revealed when doing the right thing becomes inconvenient. At the time, I was a teenager and barely listened. Years later, standing on that balcony, I finally understood. Looking back, the brunch wasn't what revealed Adrian's character. Neither was the breakup. Those moments simply removed the excuses I'd been making for him. The funeral didn't change Adrian. The conflict didn't change Adrian. It only removed the distractions that prevented me from seeing him clearly. And maybe that was the hardest truth of all. Sometimes people don't betray us. Sometimes they simply stop pretending. The city wind brushed against my face. Somewhere below, a siren echoed briefly before disappearing into the distance. Life kept moving, as it always does. I looked up at the night sky and thought about that moment in the chapel. The smell of lilies, the wooden pew, the bright glow of Adrian's phone, his voice asking to leave because he had brunch plans. Then the words that followed. 3 simple words. You should go. At the time, I thought I was talking about the funeral. I wasn't. Part of me had already understood something my heart hadn't caught up to yet. I wasn't asking him to leave the chapel. I was letting him leave my life. And strangely enough, the most important thing I wrote afterward wasn't the legal letter. It wasn't the social media response. It wasn't any of the explanations I never sent. It was a single period, one tiny mark at the end of a sentence. Because sometimes closure isn't a speech. Sometimes closure is refusing to keep a conversation alive after you finally learned the truth. That period wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even punishment. It was acceptance. The acceptance that some people will never understand the damage they caused because understanding would require them to see beyond themselves. And that was okay. I didn't need an apology anymore. I didn't need accountability. I didn't need him to agree with my version of events. I just needed peace. And at last I had it.